Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to our weekly Elite Deep Dive guide for DeepRockGalactic, where I help you get through the weekly Elite Deep Dive just a little bit better and a little bit more efficiently. So let's not waste any time and get right into this week's video and talk about this week's Elite Deep Dive, Fierce Thunder. So first, talking about the basic details for this week's Elite Deep Dive, the biome that it takes place on is the dense biozone. So not too many crazy things that you need to worry about. The dense biozone can sometimes be a little bit confusing in terms of cave generation, and we did have a little bit of that in this week's dive. And then the main hazard or issue that you have to really worry about in our runs were the NATO site shockers. As I've said many times before on the channel, I do not like these guys. They're very annoying and they show up constantly throughout the course of the entire run. Between them and the confusing cave generations, it can be a little bit tricky to get through this particular Elite Deep Dive, but thankfully it's not as bad as it could be. And also talking about specific drinks you could get from the Abyss Bar, actually Dark Morkite would be a good choice because there are several Morkite collecting missions in this week's dive, so it can make that go a lot quicker. But then of course you could also go with Rocky Mountain because there's a good amount of digging that you have to go through, and then Red Rock Blaster would never be a bad choice either. Then talking about the actual stages that you will have to go through on this week's Elite Deep Dive, first in stage 1 you will have to do a point extraction mission where you have to collect 10 aquatic gems, and you will also have to collect 2 alien eggs with the lethal enemies hazard active on this stage. Then in stage 2 you will have to fight 2 dreadnoughts while also collecting 150 Morkite. And there's actually no hazards or anomalies active on this stage at all. And then in stage 3 you will have to do a deep scan where you find 5 resonance crystals and then again find 150 Morkite. And you will have the low gravity anomaly and the elite threat warning active on this stage as well. So as you can see, there is a good amount of variety with this particular Elite Deep Dive, but there is quite the focus on finding minerals, as well as difficult enemies that you will have to come up against. Now going into the actual cave generation for each stage, first talking about stage 1, since it is a point extraction mission, it's a pretty wide open room. There's not too many winding corridors or any side paths that you really need to go onto, and thankfully the aquatic gems are all pretty easy to find. There wasn't too many hidden ones, at least not that I could find. Thankfully, the teammates that I had were pretty good at finding them, as I was more preoccupied with just fighting off the enemies. But overall, it didn't take us too long to collect all of the gems, and the eggs, thankfully, are both pretty close to the actual main platform, so you shouldn't have too much trouble getting them. Again, keep in mind that it is lethal enemies on this particular stage, so you are going to want to be quite agile. That way you don't let them hit you too much. And since it is a point extraction type cave generation, you have plenty of room to be able to kite the enemies around. And if you're somebody like Scout or Driller, or if you just have Dash, which I was running for this whole entire dive, you can stay away from the enemies pretty easily. And just keep in mind that once you first spawn in, since it is a point extraction, you are going to be met by a ton of enemies right away because that's just how they like to start it. And talking about stage 2 with the dreadnoughts and the Morkite mining, this one was not really too confusing. Thankfully, both of the cocoons are pretty close to the spawn room and they're on opposite sides, so you have a pretty good idea on how to get to them. And talking about the dreadnoughts, we got the twins first and then we got the normal dreadnought, so not too difficult. Thankfully, we didn't have a hive guard. And although we could have brought them to the spawn room as is the normal strategy, the rooms that the cocoons are in are actually pretty defendable on their own, so if you wanted to just fight them where they are, that's also a good idea as well. But you could also bring them back to the main spawn room. That strategy is never a bad idea. And then the Morkite, there's plenty of it scattered around among all of the different rooms that these dreadnoughts are in, as well as the pathways leading up to it. And since most of us on the team had Dark Morkite, we were able to gather them very quickly, and it really didn't take us a whole lot of time at all. Then talking about stage 3, since it is a deep scan that is on dense biozone, unfortunately the caves for this were incredibly wonky, and it took us quite a while to get to everything that we needed to get to. Thankfully, because this mission does have low gravity, we were able to traverse a little bit easier, so that sped up the process a little bit, but still the resonance crystals are quite widely spread apart. They are in very different locations of the map. Some of them are very up high in spots that it took me a while to get to. Some of them are quite down low. So while splitting up might be the best opportunity for you if you want to get it done quickly, you do have to be careful because, again, remember there are elite threat enemies active on this particular stage. So you want to make sure that you have the ability to take them out quickly if you do run into them. And then for the Morkite, the same sort of premise applies as it does in the last stage, where it's scattered pretty well across the entire caves, and since you are going to be traversing a lot just to try to find the resonance crystals, you're probably going to collect more than enough Morkite as to what you're going to need, because you only need 150. Again, we had dark Morkite, so it didn't take us long at all, but even without that, you have plenty of Morkite along the way to collect. So now going into actual class setups, this week I went through with Engineer just because it was something comfortable, and I went through with probably one of my personal favorite comfort builds that I like to default to whenever doing anything, essentially. Just a simple pump action Warthog with the overdrive booster shard refractor, and it worked out incredibly well. The pump action shotgun was phenomenal at taking out enemies pretty quickly, and the overdrive booster was my panic button to handle any of those elite threats on stage 3, or just any sort of problematic threat, or those approaching groups of enemies that I wanted to delete pretty quickly. And I personally went through with the single sentry just because that's what I'm more comfortable with, but double sentry would work out perfectly fine and arguably probably a bit better. For stage-specific tips, you don't really need to worry too much about anything for any of the classes that you don't already know defaultly about your role. For example, in stage 1 for the Engineer, really all you need to do is just make sure that you're constantly setting up platforms near the aquatic gems that you know your team is going to need assistance to get to, and make sure to constantly keep your sentry gun deployed, especially on this stage, because of course the lethal enemies are going to be coming at you, so you want to make sure that you have as much damage going out on them as possible so they can't get to you. And then also make sure that you are prepared for the inevitable swarm from the eggs, so setting up either on or near the main platform, that way your team has a good fallback point, is always a good practice. For stage 2, collecting the Morkite is really going to be quite quick, especially if you have the dark Morkite drink, so your main focus is just whittling down the dreadnoughts as quickly as possible, and again, the build setup that I had helped me do that quite well. Make sure you set up your sentry guns constantly and just have constant good communication with your team. And then for stage 3, there really isn't a whole lot that you can do aside from just making sure that you take out any elite threat that you find, and then just make sure that you set up platforms on any sort of stubborn piece of Morkite that you find. That way your scout or yourself can get to pretty easily because you do have low gravity. And then your main value comes from the actual descent of the drill evader, because you're able to keep the enemies at bay very easily. Now going through other class setups, first talking about the driller. The driller has a lot of potential that he has for this particular elite deep dive, so you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to build crafting. Something very straightforward like a sludge blast sludge pump with a persistent plasma EPC could work incredibly well, because it gives you good burst damage against the dreadnoughts, as well as helping you keep groups of enemies at bay, and it's just good for slowing down and debilitating enemies as they try to get close to you. Stage specific tips, again, there isn't really anything you need to worry about aside from your normal role. In stage 1, collect the aquatic gems that you can easily get to, and do your best to keep the enemies at bay since they are lethal. In stage 2, keep the dreadnoughts debilitated as much as you possibly can and collect as much Morkite as possible, and just make it easier for your teammates to get from point to point. And then stage 3, you probably have the most value just simply because, again, the cave system is very wonky because it is a deep scan cave. So do the best that you possibly can to focus on getting the resonance crystals, especially if you can tell that they are kind of far away, because you by far have the best opportunity to get to them. And then just focus on defense when it comes to the drill evader section. For the scout, you have a lot of different flexibility, again, similar to the driller, so there are a lot of different ways that you can get yourself out. In our case, our scout was actually running a pretty efficient setup. He was using a combination of an aggressive venting Drak with a embedded detonator Zukov's build, and not only did it do really well at keeping the enemies at bay and taking out adds, but during the dreadnought section, it worked incredibly well at taking huge chunks out of them very fast, so that really helped us trivialize the dreadnought section. Going over stage specific tips, again, at stage 1, since you are the scout, you by far have the most value when it comes to collecting the aquatic gems and the eggs. Just make sure you focus on the ones that your teammates would have a hard time getting to, and let them focus on the ones that are easily obtainable on the ground. And then during the second stage, again, for the dreadnoughts, the specific setup that I mentioned works incredibly well at taking large chunks out of them. So you can actually make quite short work of the dreadnoughts, which can take a lot of pressure off of your team. And then finally in stage 3, again, similar to the driller, you have a lot of mobility and are able to find the resonance crystals quite easily. So just stay focused on finding them and also taking out any elite threat that comes your way, because again, you have a good setup for it. And finally, talking about the gunner, since there are a lot of tough enemies and powerful enemies on this particular stage, you want to have a good build that is capable of clearing out enemies very quickly. Our gunner was running a neurotoxin autocannon build, which worked incredibly well at softening up and debilitating enemies as well as taking them out very quickly. And you can honestly pair this up with any of his sidearms, so something like a Magic Bullets Bulldog would work out incredibly well, as it just allows you to spread poison to essentially everything that comes your way. Stage tips: in stage 1, your main focus should primarily just be on enemy control. Take out the enemies before they get to your teammates because again, they're going to hit really hard, and then grab any materials that you can along the way to help ease the burden of the rest of your teammates. Grab any nitra, if you can find one of the eggs, that would work out very well, or any easy to reach acquired gems would help out your team a lot. In stage 2, you can do very good damage against the dreadnoughts, especially with your poison. You can keep constant debilitating damage on them, and again, if you're running the autocannon, you have a good amount of power to just be able to take them out even without the poison. And then finally, in stage 3, since you don't have a whole lot of mobility, it's going to be hard for you to find the resonance crystals. So I would say stick with one of your teammates or try your best to find the morkite or any other minerals you can find, while also keeping tabs on any elite enemies that are around you until the actual descent of the drill elevator, where you have much more value because you are able to just cull the enemies as they get close to you. So all in all, this particular elite deep dive was not too bad, especially since there's one stage that doesn't have any sort of mutators or modifiers active on it. The dreadnought rolls that you get for this particular stage is not too bad because it's only the twins and the normal dreadnoughts. That's pretty good. And the main thing you have to worry about is just keeping the enemies off of you, because in stage 1, they're going to hit really hard. And in stage 3, you're going to randomly come across very tough enemies. We had several elite Praetorians and elite slashers that tried to come after us. So make sure you're calling out either your position or the enemy position constantly. That way your teammates know exactly what to do. And as always, if you have good communication and coordination, regardless of what build or setup you're running, you should be able to get through this elite deep dive pretty easily. And if you have any tips for this particular elite deep dive or just elite deep dives in general, be sure to put them down in the comments to help everybody get through these a little bit faster. Anyway, hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, please be sure to let me know by hitting that like button and consider becoming a member and subscribing today, as it really helps me out a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, I'll see you in the next video.